So let's get started, and then I'm sure people will trickle in while we're doing introductions as well. Can everybody hear me? Great. So hello, welcome to the first workshop of July 19th, at least in some places around the world. This workshop is, first and foremost, I would say on behalf of the organizers of the summer school, Andrea and I would like to thank both the facilitators who conceived of and proposed this workshop and the participants that will be contributing to it for the next 2 hours. The workshop is titled on Pedagogical Transparency, Evaluating the Effects and Consequences of Teaching Methods. A brief overview that everybody has hopefully seen on Luma in an effort to identify and address inequities created through entrenched pedagogical precedents and assumptions. This workshop consists of role-playing exercises in which faculty place themselves in the position of students reading a course exercise, followed by an open-ended discussion focusing on what a transparent approach to teaching and learning architecture engenders. I won't take up too much time. I'll just briefly do introductions, and then I'll pass it on to the facilitators. So in lieu of a traditional introduction, I guess we asked the facilitators of the workshop to tell us why they participated, what their agendas were coming into this year-long faculty learning community that they will talk to you about, and finally, what is at stake for each and every one of them. So for Amber, Bartosh is a design instructor. Amber says, so this was actually written in the first person, so I'm going to try to deliver it. It's going to be interesting. Amber says that as a design instructor, her training is in design and not teaching. She recognized in this work an opportunity to challenge the inherited pedagogy of her instructors and to address her assumptions about what creates an effective and inclusive teaching environment. Lori Brown says she participated because she was seeking to evolve as an educator and needed both the space and the time to do this kind of work. She was also seeking a community of like-minded colleagues, also committed to evolution and revolution. Like bell hooks, she believes that the classroom is the most radical space of the academy and wants to be as transparent and effective as she can, both as a political act and because she wants architectural education to become more responsive to the world's most pressing issues. And finally, what is at stake for Lori is the future of architecture and the world at large. Britt Eversole says that as he encounters an increasingly diverse student body who are both more sophisticated than he was as a student, but also who face challenges and complexities that are more complex than what he was experiencing at their age, he finds that the design and learning methods that were used in his own education are simply no longer effective. For Joe Godlewski, after teaching in academia for a few years, says Joe, he felt like he was finally getting a hang of how to teach. However, the challenges presented in the past few years have caused him to reflect on his own teaching practices and latent assumptions. The workshop allowed him to critically examine his approach to assignments and to share it with peers for feedback. Emily Pellicano says that observing that advancements in technology and digital media were being adopted into designing studio assignments, but not necessarily being reflected in the design studio pedagogy, led her to participate in TILT that we'll hear a lot more about, in hopes of learning new strategies to engage technology in improving students' learning experiences, not simply their technical skills. And finally, Yutaka says that she realized that neither teaching nor practice proceed as planned ever, and we need to use our mistakes and confusions as part of research and experimentation. And in our profession, professors are expected to teach correctly. And so she's participated in the workshop because she was looking for methods that could turn students and colleagues into allies instead of sort of treating students as people that we have to trick into thinking that we are superior as their instructors. Before I pass it on, I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping. Workshops are recorded and shared with everyone who has registered for the 2022 ABC school. So participating in this workshop is an agreement to be recorded. If there are privacy concerns, you may turn off your camera and obscure your name. Otherwise, we strongly encourage you to keep your cameras on for the purpose of community building. And the recordings will be made available, and you can see the link. There are also a few rules about how we run the Zoom session. Like I was saying, turn on your video if possible, if you're comfortable. Take care of yourself, take breaks, eat, drink. It's a long session, so make sure that you're feeling fine throughout it. If you need to step away, please turn off your video so that it's not distracting. Add your pronouns as part of your Zoom name. Respect the person speaking. Keep chat to a minimum. Chat to everybody. It can get a little disruptive sometimes. This is more for the second half of the workshop when we'll all be together. Mute your microphone when you're not speaking. We've all had too many experiences of that. And then this, some of you might be less familiar with, but if you want to speak, and again, we're going to break up into small groups. This isn't relevant for that, but when we come back, if you want to speak, just type stack in the chat to everybody. We will be keeping track of that, Andrea and I, and calling on you. And a few more of these guidelines in terms of acknowledging and using and respecting people's pronouns. That's why we're asking everybody to put them, to change their name, to include them, using I statements unless there's a reason to sort of believe that you're speaking for others, listening very carefully before speaking, assuming good faith and positive intent. I'm assuming everybody who's actually in this workshop is already coming in with these in mind, but we sort of like to go through these guidelines before starting a workshop anyway. Respect the spirit of the progressive stack, and that means if somebody has already said that they want to speak before you, don't try to jump the line. We do occasionally make some exceptions for direct responses. If that's the case, you can actually send a message to Andrea and me, and we can make accommodations for that so that you don't have to wait, for 3 points later to sort of respond to something if it's urgent. But if you do so, try to keep it short and very relevant. Sometimes we will also take some liberties as moderators and give people the floor if they haven't spoken a lot. So that's sort of the idea that, stack is sort of the way the way everybody's sort of putting their name on the list, but sometimes we'll have to make accommodations to make sure that everybody's heard. I think that's basically it. And remember that democracy and organizing are messy, and that's okay. So these workshops will be a really interesting way of sort of meeting one another and getting some interesting outcomes at the end. And one last note before we close, we'll reiterate this at the end. We do really intend this. I know you referred to this year-long experiment, but in some ways we are also expecting the 2022 summer school to turn into almost a year-long, if not a multi-year long experiment, in the sense that we want these workshops to yield learning objectives. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But try to think of this sort of as the beginning of a longer engagement that we're all going to be committed to. And with that, I'll pass it on to the facilitators.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, good. Thank you, Pellicano, for the amazing introduction. You really kind of covered the ground rules, which was, I wanted to be absolutely clear about that, because again, I think that the workshop that we've been working with over the past year has been so much based on this collective spirit and kind of respecting the ideas of others. I really want to thank everyone for joining the conversation today. And really kind of continuing our own process of trying to evolve these ideas that, as Pellicano mentioned, we've been working with really for the past year. Workshops like these are really impossible without the participation of the actual participants themselves. In some ways, a workshop like this could just merely be kind of abstract goals, and you can kind of learn them by rote. But what we have found over the past year has been how our own experiences, and thank you for kind of describing all the kind of different reasons why we entered this workshop to begin with, really start to kind of put some texture on some of these ideas. It becomes much more kind of tangible. Also, in the introduction, Camilla mentioned the kind of introduction here, right? In an effort to identify and address inequities created through entrenched pedagogical precedents and assumptions, this workshop consists of role-playing exercises. Just some things I want to kind of point out here. Yes, there are kind of role-playing exercises. So again, I think trying to play along or share as openly as possible is the way that, at least based on our experiences, you can get the most out of this. Also, these kind of role-playing exercises will be followed by an open-ended discussion focusing on what a transparent approach to teaching and learning architecture engenders. Right. How do I get to the next? Just keep going back and forth. I mentioned the kind of disparate reasons why we came to this kind of workshop in the beginning. What we found in one of the kind of key learning moments for us in constructing these kind of assignments and working through them collectively was really having a solid why. These are one of these kind of tested assumptions that we have when we give out kind of assignments to our students. We assume that students know why this is important and what is at stake. Often that's not the case. So through these role-playing exercises, we found that, yeah, you just need to kind of make this kind of objectively clear. The why is critical both at a kind of larger conceptual level, because like, why are we here? Why are we doing this? I'm going to try my best to kind of speak for the group here. But as you saw from the introduction, we all came with very disparate interests, but there's a kind of overlap of some of these ideas as well. I think the first reason for us was that there's an equity crisis in higher education due to high school success strategies not translating into higher education. That's probably the best way we could phrase that idea. We have students coming from very different backgrounds, very different kind of educational models, and getting through to them has provided a distinct kind of challenge. I would add to that, the past couple of years, we've had just unheard of kind of stresses and challenges to the kind of educational environment. I think the COVID epidemic absolutely caused us to kind of rethink our approaches. And in a lot of ways, the inequities that we're talking about only got more exaggerated. We add to this that additionally first-generation students and those from less advantaged communities are at a disadvantage in college because often higher education has not responded to their learning needs. I think another reason that many of us came to the workshop last summer was that we are taught to be architects and not teachers. So we tend to repeat how we are taught. That's definitely the case for me, so myself included in that statement. I think there's a sense, and it may have to do with the kind of professional alignment of architecture, where we tend to fall into this idea that we are these kind of experts, that we know how to kind of work out either as professional researchers or professional architects, and then that will just kind of translate and we will therefore be good teachers. I think another thing that kind of insight that came about was in graduate school, a lot of people didn't even have one class on how to teach, right? It's just one of those things that you're just expected to do. And we don't really have a chance to kind of reflect and share with our teaching methods with our peers. This workshop definitely kind of allowed that. I think related to that point is this idea of the kind of teacher architect model, or like the kind of genius architect running the studio. I would say that there's a similar kind of idea here with professional practice, where it's almost like, particularly in the studio environment, where sometimes us as teachers seem like a boss and we have these kind of interns working with us. Really, that gets in the way of kind of a lot of creative exchange, right? So we're trying to kind of undo these kind of, again, these tacit assumptions that we've inherited and bring something else to the game. Lastly, and this might be taken the wrong way in the sense that we're some sort of like trailblazer and we're the only ones kind of experimenting with this. However, through the actual idea of transparency, right? Lots of people have experimented with this idea in educational contexts elsewhere. So in other disciplines, there's lots of kind of language about how to do this and take case studies about how people have tested these ideas in other disciplines. It's our sense that in architecture, although these ideas may have been tested elsewhere, there is something where going through Mary Ann's workshop and applying her kind of techniques, we are one of the kind of first to engage these ideas. So right off the bat, we want to know who you are. Where are you joining us from? Why are you here today? That's not to put you on the spot, that's to just help us understand everyone's kind of differential backgrounds. And again, I tried to speak for everyone, so I always feel kind of uncomfortable about that. But to kind of foster the kind of dialogue and get the most out of the session. I believe Britt posted in the chat the link to the kind of Google spreadsheet where you can supply that information. Lori, you're muted. Laura, you're muted.
Thank you. You think you would finally never do that again. So thanks, Joe. I'll talk briefly about the what and how of this. And I want to back up for just one moment. The inspiration really came from speaking with, through many conversations with Martha Deedy, who's the director of our University Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence. And at the time, I was serving as the director of diversity, equity, inclusion in the school. So I was trying to think of ways to bring her expertise in teaching and learning and pedagogy into and working with our faculty. And as the university began and continues to incorporate DEIA frameworks into all aspects of the university, we saw an opportunity to bring these ideas into conversation with the faculty who teach architecture design studios. Prior to doing this, there were many conversations that were happening amongst many of us about the challenges we were all facing within the design teaching format and context. And we saw significant gaps, as Joe mentioned, in access to different pedagogical models. So with the support from CTLE, we committed to establishing this year-long learning community, which now hopefully will move into the second year working with all of you, where we were introduced to Marianne Winkelmies in her Transparency in Learning and Teaching project, which is out of Brandeis University. And as Joe mentioned, we are the first program to work with her within her structure. And TILT aspires to advance equitable teaching and learning practices that reduce systemic inequities in higher education through two main objectives. The first is to promote students' conscious understanding of how they learn. And the second is to enable faculty to gather, share, and promptly benefit from current data about students' learning by coordinating our efforts across disciplines, institutions, and countries. And as she discussed with us, there is the crisis in higher education, as Joe had mentioned. So we found this space for this faculty discussion that ensued over the past year quite vital to our individual and collective understandings about the ways we teach architecture and began to create ways to transform our teaching and design classrooms. Many of us have never had such a space like this before. And it really proved transformational in our collective awareness about the many ways access to design education can be hampered by our own language, how we write our assignments, our assumptions of what students read and what they hear from us, and how these assumptions can often lead to gaps in their ability to fully understand what we are asking them to do, thus hindering their abilities to be successful. So if you, next slide, please. So as he's transitioning into the how, and this is what we're going to be sharing with you in the workshop. Is it not working? I can keep going. We were asked to bring an assignment to a workshop where that we have given or that we would be giving soon. And we were asked to evaluate this assignment through the TILT framework. If you next, yes. So part of how we were asked to think about our assignment, the next one, is through three questions. One, what is the specific content knowledge you hope the student will gain? The second is, what skills do you want the student to practice through the exercise you're asking them to do? And the third, how will these skills be useful in their life beyond the course and even beyond college? So these were, things we may or may not be thinking about every time you write an assignment, but Marianne really wanted us to think explicitly about these 3 criteria as we evaluated both ours and a teammate's assignment. So the next one. So to go into it just a little bit more detail about the tilt intervention that she has coined. So the purpose is really to think about how is design knowledge to be gained? What are the kinds of ways we're asking when we write these assignments to think about what explicitly is that design knowledge? And what are the skills required and needed to be practiced, both in the short term for the assignment, but also for long-term relevance for the student beyond the time frame of our course and even beyond the time frame of their education. And then thinking, and this is one thing I think many of us had not really thought about strategically, is what is this knowledge going to do and gain for them beyond their lives? And she used a 5-year marker as an example, like what that you're asking them to do will have impact as they embark into their career. So it requires us to think about the task we're asking students to think through. What will they do? How do they do it? What are the steps that you ask them, that you expect, you assume that they will follow through? And what sorts of guidelines should we be providing for them to do this? There was a lot of discussion we had about how much do we reveal, how do we create an assignment that allows it to be open-ended, so there's exploration and creativity and design possibility, and not just a kind of step-by-step process through a design problem. So there was a lot of discussion and a bit of pushback towards her when we talked about, well, we want there to be an open-endedness to the way we write these, because that actually helps, or we assume helps them have more freedom to pursue and think as a designer. And then also she was really pretty emphatic about how do you create criteria for success? What is some sort of checklist or rubric in advance so students can self-evaluate themselves as they're going through the exercise? And what does excellence look like? What kind of real-world examples can you provide students to see so they have some sort of ability to model or build upon examples that you provide? And that was also another space of a lot of discussion about how much are we predetermining outcomes by the kinds of examples we give them? If we don't want to do that, then how do we also at the same time still provide examples of what we are hoping for them to achieve in terms of excellence? And I think yes. So I'll turn it over to Emily and Yutaka.
Actually, right here is like an example of like a before and after of a assignment, which we just to kind of show you what, how we were applying it to architecture assignments. And it probably is a little bit difficult to read the exact text there, but here's 2 different assignments that are related to each other, one given 2 years before the other. The second was after I've been introduced to the TILT methodology. And you can see that the second one is slightly longer. It's got a little bit more bullet points as well. Fortunately, in the assignment, I'd already used the introductory statement to identify why I felt like it was important for them to engage with this material and with these skills. Essentially, the time and adding time was critical to communication, visualization in an animation. And then the task and the steps are expanded. So I was really thinking through what they need to do, but if you read those steps, you'll see that they're still slightly open-ended that allow for some kind of design creativity. So you will use a specific tool, you will consider something. So there's still just vague enough to give the student room to experiment. You can also see that I separated out the criteria into a separate section, but where before it was integrated into the process. And so I wanted to make that a little bit clearer. I've also added examples and resources from outside of the class and within. And then lastly, I expanded on what exactly I was looking for in the deliverables so that it was understood what was to be expected. So I think what we're going to find in the workshop is that we have our intentions, and we probably are thinking that we're already covering the purpose, task, and criteria. But when you have to break it out and really identify it in your syllabus, even with the term like, say, task, or in my case, process and assessment, it really helps you recognize whether or not you've got that in your assignments or not. And so now we'll turn it over to Emily and Yutaka.
Thanks, Amber and Lori and Joe. I think you all gave really critical pieces of this little like crumbs leading up to the role-playing exercise, which for me was terrifying. Like role play for me felt really uncomfortable. So we're going to demonstrate it for you so that you can see that it doesn't have to be a big dramatic event, but really something that the more you embrace it and really try to put yourself in the shoes of a student, especially that part is really helpful. So Yutaka and I are actually going to be teaching first year together in the fall. I'm one of the co-coordinators, and we have just started barely putting this assignment together. So we're going to kind of take advantage of this as an opportunity to workshop for you and demonstrate, and also get a little work done on developing the assignment. So this is possibly a little bit maybe underdeveloped with some of the assignments that you might have brought with you today to workshop. And that's okay. I think you'll get the important thing is to kind of let you see the role play and help you feel comfortable with that. So I've shared in the chat a link to Concept Board where we have a pretty clear, I think, outline of if you're in room number 1, there's a space for assignment number 1. So one of the partners, and then assignment number 2 for the other partner to upload their assignments. And once you've uploaded your assignments, give each other a few minutes to read the other's assignment. Once you've read the assignment, pick one person to go first as the teacher introducing the assignment, and the other will play the role of the student. So Yutaka and I will start out by taking a look at the example that we have for you here. And so,
are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Right now?
Yeah.
You're seeing the Google Doc of your assignment?
Oh, wait, we're seeing the Google Doc. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Okay. So you can do something similar on the concept board. We did this in advance just to kind of move things along. So Yutaka has read the assignment, and I will give a brief verbal introduction, I think, right?
Sure.
Okay, so this is a first year project, their first assignment, in fact. So this is to the very, very first day of their studio experience. All right, so hello, welcome. We're going to go over our first assignment today. And first I want to go over our learning objectives for the project. This is your first studio assignment. You're going to be learning many things. One of the most important things that you're going to learn is a skill of drawing, representation. So how do you draw in order to communicate? And the basic skills, methods, and concepts necessary to engage in fundamentals of architectural design. The first project is going to involve you selecting an object to draw. And you're going to be drawing orthographic projections, plan, section, and elevation. And I'll leave it at that. You can imagine how that would go on. And I think there's some room there to discuss, how much is too much to say. But for now, I'll just zip it and let Yutaka be the student.
First of all, I want to acknowledge how courageous Emily is, putting herself in this position to receive credit basically from all of us, exposed in front of us. And that's exactly what this exercise of becoming transparent teacher means. It means to make ourselves vulnerable and expose perhaps our shortcomings and try to get better. So that was the first thing we had to do. And we were actually paired in the exercise that we started a year ago, Emily and I. So this is exactly what we did. And I guess I could pretend that I'm 17 and I've never heard the word sections and elevations, or you could also talk through and flip-flop, just like I did in the comment, flip-flop between pretending that you've never been exposed, or looking at it from the perspective of someone who is trying to innovate new ways of teaching architectural design and become, multiple personalities. I think there are many ways to run this role play, but for now, I will pretend that I'm 17. So Professor Pellicano, in the second sentence in the learning objectives, the first sentence is very clear. We're going to learn how to design here. And the second and the third sentences, it sounds like we're going to learn representation instead of design. So what's the relationship between representation and design? How are they different? Are they the same thing?
Good question. I think we could make that more clear in that statement. Maybe even introducing what representation means to begin with. I think that's a good point, and that's an example of one of the assumptions that we bring with us, that the students are, as sophisticated as they are, we need to identify that they're not all the same level of sophistication, and need to make this a little bit more equitable in terms of its legibility. So, so I could go on to elaborate there, and I would hope too that, and expect that we'll be giving a lecture that goes along with this that helps introduce some of these. But I think you'll find too, depending on what level of student you're teaching and you're writing an assignment for, there's different levels of that explicit clarity that might be scalable.
As I was reading this earlier, I noticed 3 assumptions, perhaps. Now I'm putting on the hat of someone who is looking at it from a professor interested in innovating new ways of teaching and trying to find assumptions. And it's not a crit, it's something that we all do. And I just want to think it through, since I'll be teaching this as well in August. So there were assumptions about the language and architecture. When I first started learning architecture, I realized how much we talk in architecture. It's very rhetorical. There's a lot of describing what design is, or what we're trying to do, what the meanings are in space. And I didn't know that when I was coming into architecture, and there's certain value placed in rhetoric in architecture. So that's one thing, and I think we find that out more as we go on. Another thing is the value in particular type of architecture. So for example, in the second sentence, we will investigate issues of representation, form, and space instead of other issues. And that is unclear why those 3 are the most important issues. Why not material? Why not climate? Why not meanings and culture? But it's representation, form, and space. and there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that it would be great to have a conversation about why those were chosen and not the others, and what they mean. Like, what does a representation mean, and what is form and what is space? They are not explained later, but perhaps they were in the syllabus, not in this particular assignment. The same for scale, order, and sequence. They mean different things in architecture than in other professions. So the next thing, the project brief, I thought this was a great sentence. The second sentence, as one of the primary mediums through which architects represent ideas about design, drawings serve not merely as tools of communication, but as a venue to generate deliberate relationships between 2 dimensions and 3-dimensional space. That's why we're doing this. That is very clear to me. So I wish this was the first sentence, so that's the goal, and that's the difference between drawings used as just as representation, and then drawing used as a generator of ideas and a process of design. So I think that's great. It's still, I'm not sure, I'm going to put on a 17-year-old hat here. What is the translation between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions? What does it mean, and what would be the problem?
Well, I think that you'll learn through the next steps in the assignment. So we're talking right now about the why you're doing this, and why that's important might come through some of the what and the how. That might be something to think about in terms of writing the brief too, for a rewrite, as to allude in some of that writing that through the following assignments, you will begin to understand the relationship between 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional representation and the importance of those.
I think we're running out of time, a little slow here. So the last question would be going back to some of the issues that I brought up, how architecture is rhetorical, and we use words in our particular ways, like hierarchy, progressive sequential increments, and narrative, and they all mean different things in architecture. So as a 17-year-old, I would not understand exactly how to make a better hierarchy, how I would be evaluated in creating a particular type of progressive sequential increments, which one's better and which ones we shouldn't do. In a narrative, why should an architect understand a narrative and make a narrative in design? What does it mean? Those would be my questions.
Yeah, I think these are good places to add maybe a footnote with a link to some of those specific examples that Amber mentioned and added to her brief and in the example she shared with us. So that might be one way to do it, is the footnote could then take you to links listed at the bottom of the assignment, something similar to that. So we are probably about at the end of our time, so that you can get to the role play yourselves and start to work on your own assignments. So the considerations here are, one, what we think we are presenting to the students is not always that clear. And I think just taking a few minutes to think like a student is really valuable. The assumptions that we make in our assignments lead to gaps in learning and then therefore success. So those assumptions that we have, that they understand what hierarchy means or what elevation means even, you can see how they easily would lead to gaps in their success. The goals that we want the students to achieve by completing the task might not be clear at all. So the more explicit we can be about about the criteria for success, the better off we will all be. And that small changes can have a large impact. So adding simple sentences about, how this might be valuable to them later on in life can make a big difference in you want to think about reaching different students at different levels as well. So stating things in different ways multiple times, whereas often I find myself trying to be so brief, for the, so clear and succinct that I probably am eliminating some of the understanding for some students. So some of these considerations can become very clear when going through these role-playing exercises. So I think we can switch to the role play at this point, no? And then we'll come back to these purpose, task, and criteria later on in the discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think we are going to ask our moderators to create breakout rooms. And as we have asked before the session was announced, or when the session was announced, we would like you to bring your assignments and post them on the concept board so that you could share them. And just like Emily did for me, you would explain, or not, maybe, you would explain your assignment and the other person would respond by asking questions.
Great. So what I'm thinking we do is there are 13 of us, so we can break into 6 breakout rooms. And instead of doing this randomly, what I'm thinking is that we let each other choose. So each of you all who are familiar with this process, you call a room number once we've kind of set them up, and then someone else can follow you in there, if that makes sense. Does that seem like a good way of doing this?
Yeah. Originally, we thought we wouldn't join just because we thought we didn't want to dictate the right way to do this. But I think it's fine if we join too. What do you guys think? Just because there are, not that many people.
Well, as Emily said yesterday, lurking.
We could also do like three breakout rooms, and that way we've got more people and you all can sort of observe. We do it that way.
Yeah, I think that was the idea, that we would observe on concept board.
Okay.
Just kind of make sure that, if people were writing questions or highlighting or things like that, then we would assume the conversation was going along okay.
Good. All right, I have created 3 breakout rooms. They are assigned automatically, and we will.
Lara, do you have a question?
Actually, I just registered earlier today, because I wasn't sure if I should participate on this one, because I'm not actually a professor. So I don't have an actual task like a written down. So I participate in many as a student. So I was like curious to see how it was going to be. So I don't need to be assigned to any room. I can just be a curious one walking around. So you can be like 12.
Rebecca.
Hi, hello. Yeah, same. I just logged in. I was curious to know about your session because I'm also a facilitator and I will be dealing with the architecture education system, but I don't have an assignment with me. So if I don't know if I can just attend, and I would be curious to hear, but unfortunately I don't have an assignment with me.
Yeah, we hadn't thought of that happening. That's interesting. I wonder.
I mean, we could share our assignments and they can respond, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea was not to have you hover, maybe. I mean, Andrew and I were just talking it out earlier in the chat because there's not that many of us. You know, I know you feel like you have an inherent advantage in this process because you've already done this, and perhaps you've already workshopped it at least once. But maybe it's a way for more people to be involved, and you get one extra look at whatever it is.
Perhaps we should ask.
Two assignments, so can't
Perhaps we
decide.
should ask if there are people who have an assignment that they would like to share who are joining us who aren't part of the group.
Well, as you want, I can either listen to and give comments, or I mean, participate like that, or I can bring in an assignment. Like it will be the first thing that I found somewhere in this semester of teaching. I don't know.
Yeah, we can wing it.
Cool.
Are you? Do you have something specific you would like to workshop?
Is that a question to me?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I can post a piece of one of my syllabi. I teach, I don't teach studio though. I teach urban design and architectural theory, but I could post a piece of a syllabus and see what you think. Do you want me to do that? Should I put it on the board, or do you want me to just share my screen? It's easier.
Maybe we share screen, that way we capture it in a recording, and that way more people can see this later.
Okay.
Well, we do this, Peggy, I think you're on the stack, just to make sure that we answer any questions.
Fine. I was just advocating for doing what we're doing. I'm here because I thought I would role play as a student. I don't have an assignment, and so I get nervous when I came in here without being prepared. So this is all feeling more comfortable for me. So.
Yeah, so should we break out into 3 rooms and just do what we plan to do? Or should we just have one conversation?
Well, how many people want to share? Let's just take stock of how many of these we want to discuss.
I have one that I can throw up there if folks want to.
And I have one too.
I have 1 or 2 very different ones, so I wasn't sure which one was more appropriate. So do we think we can get through 3 in the time allocated to this? Then we can do it as a big group.
Yeah. And let's leave at least 10 minutes at the end for us to talk about how to transform this into actionable items.
Who wants to go first?
I'll be guinea pig. I've got one ready. Let's see. So I do not teach in architecture anymore either. This is a exhibition design program, graduate students, and it is the thesis, the equivalent of a thesis prep class. And this is the first assignment that kicks everything off. And it sort of explains the whole semester there, and then this is the actual assignment part. So I guess we can start here. That makes sense. Okay.
Could you also, can you do both? Can you put this in the concept board as well, so that we could take our time reading and
yeah, figure out
notes?
how to do that really quickly. As it's loading. I'm realizing I also need to share the pre-assignment to this one. So got that as well.
Andrea, where should we start reading?
Good question. Probably not the best assignment to start off with because it's covering a lot of ground. I send the prequel assignment out in May, and they have all summer to do it. So it's kind of self-directed, and that's the piece that if you're not looking on concept board, I'm showing on the screen. And my basic instructions to them are that this is basically a model of how the entire semester will run. And so they get to do it by themselves first, and then we do it again together over the course of the semester. So this first go around is just them running through all of the possible ways of thinking and working. And then this next step is just looking at one aspect of that. So this is probably the easiest thing to do would just be to look at the concept, context, and content diagramming that I have them do. And this is, again, something that we do on repeat every class for the entire semester, where they're trying to work through what the kind of conceptual position is, what the context is, what the content is, and it's doing it in kind of curatorial terms, since this is exhibition design, and then it's doing it in design terms. And they always have a really hard time trying to sort out the difference between those two for a while, and it takes about halfway through the semester before they're actually getting that distinction. What is a curatorial position versus what is a design position?
And these are beginning students in your program?
These are graduate students doing their thesis.
Oh, thesis, okay. Mm-hmm. So the first question we want everyone to be able to answer is, what's the purpose of the assignment? Is it clear? Can you find it? Peggy.
It's hard to know exactly what a thesis student in curation would know. So if we're kind of role playing here, I worry that my questions or things that I would say is like, that's not clear, would in fact be clear to somebody who's been in that program that long. But should I just dive in here about what first strikes me here is I don't know what direction is. And let's say it's like, I want, in my head, my capstone project is to do an exhibition on drawing in Britain in the 1960s. And I'm just totally making that up. And that's all I know. And then you're asking me to say 3 different directions. I don't know what that means. You know, does it mean that maybe I'll focus on chronology? You know, that's one way, or I'll focus on highlighting individuals and the differences between movements. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know what direction is.
And am I meant to respond, or how does this work? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
At this phase, there's a little bit of material that comes before this, and I think in that earlier part, I described that a direction could be 3 approaches to the same topic. So if you did something like what you're talking about, maybe we're looking at a specific type of drawing, or there's 3 specific drawing entries into that topic, or it could be 3 radically different topics. So you've chosen one, maybe there's 2 others that you're also interested in.
But I still wonder, direction has to do with, I assume with what you are assuming that the museum goer will learn. So one direction is you want to hit home that point, and another direction is you're going to hit home that point, and another is you're going to hit home that point. So that has to do with the thesis of the curation, right? I mean, maybe I'm just saying direction, is that a thesis? You know, the same 2 different theses. I don't, you know, that's.
Yeah, I'll go for it.
Well, and to build on that, I wonder why 3? I mean, you're sort of forcing them to make 3 different ideas. Do students sometimes think that, you know, there's one idea they favor and they do 2 others that are sort of just gratuitous because you require 3? Or, I mean, why 3? Why not 5 or 2?
I started doing that because I got students who were so obsessed about a singular topic, and a lot of them were very personal, and it became untenable at a certain period because it was just them working out like personal kind of dilemmas. So this became a way of like sort of forcing them to explore many different directions, at least at the beginning, just to see where they might go. It's a way of depreciosizing. And Rebecca, no, the students are from all sorts of backgrounds. At this point, they've had about 2 years of design studies, though. And Britt.
Thanks. Maybe to offer just a little background on some of the things that we did. 2 of the things, the techniques that jumped out to me that stick in my mind that were super effective when going through this kind of question and answer phase was the willingness to be mischievous and the willingness to make one's position very clear in the questioning. So when Lori and we were paired up as a team, we trusted each other enough to make each other a little uncomfortable with the questions that we were asking, and to push hard not only on the presuppositions that were embedded into our assignments, but also to force each other to imagine what a student from a very different background or a very different identity might see or experience when they're looking at an assignment. So to that extent of being mischievous and also adopting a position, Professor Dietz, my question to you would be, who am I designing this for? Like, who goes to exhibitions? And is that something I should be thinking about when I'm designing an exhibition? Is this just a bunch of rich people in New York who are going to go see this? And is that something that I should be thinking about? This entire practice that I've kind of signed up to get a degree in, suddenly I'm kind of realizing that I have a very particular audience, and I'm wondering if if questioning the audience, if challenging the audience, is that something that I should be thinking about? And is that something that's going to inform the way that I start to approach this assignment? Because right now it's all about ideas, and yet I'm left to wonder about how the ideas of curation are even received by different groups of people in the world.
That's a great question, and not one that I've ever gotten. And it's one that I actually am really excited to take on. The direct response is that yes, audience is very much a part of this, and it's becomes a separate exercise later in the practice or later in the semester. But that you're thinking about it up front is really kind of powerful, and I would encourage you to hold on to that. This kind of also becomes a way of finding a balance between you as a kind of independent designer and who your voice is, and also who you are talking to and who you're preparing those things for. So hopefully over the course of the next few assignments, you'll start to weigh those two and figure out who's going to be more dominant within that conversation, the audience or you as the designer. I think Palmyra is next.
Yeah, I guess I have a series of questions. It's a lot of content. So, again, I'm not sure I know enough about what your students are like or what they know, where they're at in their education to ask a question from their point of view. But the things that stand out to me in the prequel is you sort of ask them to be, you say, make sure your interests are diverse. And, if I'm that late in my education, I would ask you why. By then, maybe I just need to really be focused. I've spent however many years in education. I just want to do this. I don't see why you have to sort of prescribe diversity. The second thing would be comprehensive and thorough. And, that's kind of goes without saying. Are we asking for that because we want to make sure there's production, or because there's something that they just don't know about during research that we are trying to say? And then be risky, which is, I just don't know what that means. It's really hard to define risk, and it's defined very differently in different contexts. So that's from sort of the pre-assignment part one. Those are the things that stand out to me. And then again, because I know this is a capstone project, I would say, why be so prescriptive about pairing this interest area with a design approach, as opposed to sort of letting it be a little bit more sort of free-form what these three ideas are? And also, do you think it represents a different design approach? Does it sort of distract them in any way if they have to sort of, I understand for some students, it's nice to just throw three different things out. And for some students, it's better to just have one idea and just do 3 iterations. But I often wonder about this, how useful it is to sort of try and prescribe that process. And I know you're trying to be as accommodating as possible. I can see it in the way you're writing it out, but maybe this pairing of interest area and design ends up being a little bit more prescriptive than necessary, especially for students that advanced. Maybe this would be more useful for somebody a little bit earlier in their education. Those are my thoughts.
Should I respond? It's interesting because they are advanced in some levels, but when it comes to design, they're actually fairly underexperienced. The program is, I would say, the equivalent of them maybe making it through 2 years of architecture school. And so they don't necessarily have a whole lot of understanding at this point of what a design sort of voice is. They don't know who they are as designers still. And their tendency is going to be instead to rely on the more curatorial or content-based approach to producing a project. So for example, I had a student just get obsessed with bees. So we're going to have an entire exhibition about bees. And that's fantastic, doing a lot of work into understanding bees and bee colonies and what they do for the environment, but no real understanding of how you might pursue that as a designer. So I actually decided to start breaking them out really intentionally because I wanted them to be able to balance out their statements. They can do the curatorial side until the end of time, but their ability to actually put in a kind of design position was just not developed at this point. And so that became a kind of way of doing that. And there's an equivalent within architecture where you're just like focusing on program, for example, and not really thinking about the design or the form or the material, whatever that may be. Tom, I think you're next.
Yeah, Andrea, that's it's fascinating project. There's a larger question it raises for me though, which is the dilemma we have as educators in wanting to engage communities, and yet we're in institutions that make it difficult to engage communities. This really sort of follows on Britt's question, which is what role do you see community members as sort of co-curators in this process? There's a lot, as you probably know, there's a lot of conversation in the curatorial museum world about self-curation, about mass customized curation. The Cleveland Museum of Art, for example, has this a wall where you curate your own experience through the galleries, depending on where your interests are and what you want to explore. So how do you resolve that issue of, this is formed around what the students are interested in, as opposed to, is there a mechanism whereby the community can be also part of the curation process, maybe even part of the design process, but certainly the curation process? Is that something that you discuss in your class? And if so, how do you involve community in this?
I think that's great. I would love to do that. These have all been taught during COVID, so not necessarily an option up until this point. And I'm new to all of this as well, but I actually really love that idea. That would be a great thing to include. Peggy?
I'm thinking about the relationship between Tom's question about 3, which I think, has other aspects to it, and Britt about being mischievous, and not just mischievous, but kind of what I heard is making it clear as the person presenting the program that you've made choices and this isn't universally accepted. This is how I'm playing the game. And there's something about this, which even though somewhere you say we can't be scientific, but the rest of this looks very rational, very, and Andrea, I know you as an incredibly rational person, and thank God you're part of the lobby. But I wonder if one is combining those two things, you could just say something like, this looks falsely rational. We can't codify in certain ways, but this is a technique that I've come up with to pull out thinking that you wouldn't have automatically done or something. It just insert your acknowledgement that this isn't universal science and this rationality is, a certain language and blah, 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 and 3 is not golden, and nor is this chart. Oh, I don't know.
How Mary?
Yeah, I wonder, building on what Peggy was just saying, like in the actual assignment, you are trying to say that design research, like there's really only one way to do it. And I wonder where what Peggy is describing about how to frame this particular approach to their design research, which is more prescribed, and combine it with the way you're talking about design research in general. So is this meant to teach them what design research is? Because those, what Peggy's saying makes a lot of sense given how specific this is, but then you're really trying to make a much broader statement about how it can take different forms, but it's just the one thing. You ask a question and then you pursue it, you collect, you design, you kind of keep going back and forth, and that's what design research is.
Yeah. It's meant to be a kind of first foray. Should we keep going with mine, or do we want to try other people's just in the interest of time, or?
We do need to conclude yours, so we can go through one more and take a very short break.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your willingness to share. We, as Yutaka said, we understand and acknowledge it can be kind of hard, but thank you. I hopefully there's a lot there to think about. So who's the second assignment that would be willing to share with everyone? I thought Tom had offered, maybe. Or Pamara, you as well? Is that right? Am I remembering?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up time if there's somebody else who is joining, but if Tom isn't here, I'm happy to.
Okay.
I'm happy to share.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure if I was going to participate, so that's why I'm not entirely prepared. And they're giant, the syllabi, but I can tell you where to look. These are two different. Oh, Tom, would you like to go? I'm sorry. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me share my screen. Sorry. So as I said, this is a theory class, and there's something to me sort of fundamentally paradoxical about not only theory, but about teaching in general. I started out with the idea of we're at a time when there's questions raised by people like Robert Summel and Sarah Whiting about, are we in a kind of post-theory, post-critical age? And so the way I thought about this class is that while on one hand, I felt the need to familiarize, these are grad students, about 25 grad students, with kind of the theory, canon, and architecture, I also wanted it to be around questions that they have. So the first class was about what are the questions they have. And we basically formed the whole class around those questions. So they were driving the content. And so it was a kind of mass customization class where each one of them was also pursuing their own question. And then we were also talking about the questions that others had. And this ranged way beyond sort of traditional architectural theory. I mean, we got into theories of practice, we got into theories of higher education, theories of, the role of architecture in a university, the role of architecture generally, the idea that we're designing cities on occupied native lands. So there were a whole set of really, I thought, fascinating questions. I also gave my students a choice about whether they came in person or remained remote. I was in person, but out of 25 students, only about 4 or 5 ever came to class in person. And so we used Miro board. There was both a collective Miro board where they were responding to each other's work, as well as their own individual board, where they then presented whatever issue that they were concerned about. They had to, and I developed individualized readings for each one of them based on the questions they were pursuing. So, they all ended up reading a number of sort of canonical texts, but they were sort of customized to the questions that they had. You can see a little bit here, the format. So I continue to teach in Zoom, even though some of us were in person. Yet I had so the student evaluations of this class were extremely strong. Although my colleagues really started raising questions about, but did they get, enough architectural theory? In other words, did they all read enough if this is their main theory class? And so there's this tension between, the role of the faculty member to convey certain content, as opposed to what I strongly believe that education has got to be around what are the questions that students have, what are the purposes they have. And in a lot of this, we talked as well, because I had a lot of one-on-one time with each student. So in a way, it was kind of like a studio, as we talked a lot about what they want to do with their career or their lives. And so it was this constant sort of self-questioning and my guiding them to resources. So that was basically it. Although it's interesting, I think, because of the critique of some of my colleagues about whether I was sufficiently teaching architectural theory, this course is now going to be taught by another faculty member. So, I mean, that's fine. I have other courses I teach as well. I teach a lot of community based urban design classes too. So, but I thought that was also interesting that I came under a fair amount of criticism from my colleagues. Also, they didn't like the idea that I didn't require my students to come in person, which I thought was also interesting. But anyway, that I also posted this up on the shared board because it's kind of hard. Well, I guess I can zoom down a little bit so you can read more of it.
I'll get us started since I signed up for a stack. I think this is fascinating. I've never seen anything like this, and I wish this had been offered to me. I also think it's a daring approach in the sense that it requires a lot of personal commitment and time, which in most cases isn't really something that a lot of professors do or can do. So this is really kind of amazing. I guess the main question I have, and I don't know the answer. I think this is sort of the problem with this type of approach, a more personalized approach, but maybe it makes more sense later in the curriculum, is how do you have a conversation about the first paragraph, which says there is no right or wrong, there are all these different approaches, if people are taking the different approaches to start with. So what's the meeting ground? And is that a separate course, right? Does that come, maybe you have to have the foundations and then this is the second theory course, or sort of how do you evaluate in the limited amount of time you have dedicated to this type of material in architecture school, how to teach people the stuff that they're interested in and really sort of help them with their pursuit of what's most interesting and sort of how that trajectory works. And then also having a conversation, a common ground where you can be critical of things that may or may not make sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've struggled with that paradox, which is how do you balance these things? And you're right. I mean, in fact, that was an argument one of my colleagues made, is that how do the students know if they haven't had sort of an opportunity to read sort of the canonical texts in architectural theory, how do they know what their questions are? So yeah, you could envision that there'd be a two-part class. This would be sort of the second one after they've, although, it's interesting. There was a lot of interest in reading these things because of texts that were relevant. But I'm really quite critical of this sort of historicist way in which architectural theory is taught, that, there are these certain books and they kind of come in a chronological order, and then some theorist is arguing with another one. And all of that strikes me as being, to what end? I mean, I have a certain kind of sense of sort of who cares. And in the end, I really think that has to guide us all as educators. It's like, why should the students care about this? And I think we have an obligation to help them see why it's relevant to them and to their lives, their careers, and but.
Peggy, I think you're next, but that may have been for an earlier.
Yeah. And I read this and my theory teacher hat goes exactly to your colleagues, is like, what? This is like the world, it's like, it's psychology, it's like,
right.
It's like, oh my God, but what I really think is that this is a critique of the institution of architecture theory. And the fact that you're going to such fundamental questions is kind of like, what do you think about when you look at a building, and what issues in the world are you bringing to this thing, so that we can really unfold what thinking about architecture is, very, very specific way, is totally necessary, and no one's doing it. And that's why I think that it's a critique of what we're all doing and the assumptions that lie behind it that are never asked. So if I'm now wanting to put that into the syllabus, somehow say that you might just say theory. My position is, that theory is leaving behind the question about why theory matters, and why theory matters has to do with what do we think about when we think building, or what preconceptions are we doing it. And so this is one method at starting from that basic question, but hopefully getting to its relationship to the canon, which we're going to explode. I mean, I
Yeah.
just wonder.
Yeah, no, that's great, Peggy. That's a great suggestion.
Lori.
I really appreciate the kind of open-endedness of what you've created. And one thing I keep thinking about, and it goes back to, what does success look like in this course, and what are the modes of evaluation and criteria evaluation? And then also thinking about how, I think it's kind of brilliant that the students in some ways become the driver of the bibliography. But I wonder about how that creates a collective intellectual engagement versus the kind of atomization and further kind of individually directed areas of research and thinking. And it seems to me, given the very brief handout you've shared with us, I would want to really understand more how this comes back together to infuse a collective intellectual project of the class, so that students are required to have to think and listen and respond to their classmates and the different positions, identities, life experiences that they're all bringing to the table, and thinking and reading and evaluating the text through. So my one concern on this is how it helps further support the individual versus thinking about how we as educators are like the collective engagement direction that we hope to see architecture move more radically towards, versus the kind of individual atomized lives we're all living and further enhanced by various modes of technology. But I think it's amazing to give so much power to the students to help direct the content, and it gives me something to think about moving forward for my own classes. So that's brave. And I really I applaud you on that.
Thank you, Laura. One of the things I learned, so I don't know how many of you use Miroboard or other similar platforms, but so we had everything on Miroboard. So all of the students' individual work was visible to everybody else. And then we also had the collective question. And what was fascinating is how good the students were in teaching each other. In other words, I was just one of many people teaching. The students were bringing all kinds of other content, because these are grad students, so they came from biology backgrounds and philosophy backgrounds, all these other backgrounds, and they were bringing all of that content to these the question we asked each week, as well as to the work of each other. And it was an amazing kind of community of learning and of teaching going on, of which I was sort of many times felt like I was kind of there along for the ride. I was learning so much from them. So anyway, that these open platforms are really interesting pedagogical tools, I think.
Britt.
So I'm super, as someone who also teaches theory, there's part of this that I would love to appropriate, except I can't quite figure out how to do it with 100 200 students. I'm guessing you don't have 150 to 200 students.
25.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could do this with 150 students. But one of the aspects of the transparency technique that we've been working with for the last year is in part making yourself as an instructor transparent to your students, which is to say that on the one hand, I think that the syllabus that you've put in front of us also, along the lines of Peggy's comment that it's critiquing the institution of theory, I think it's also critiquing the notion of hierarchy in relation to how knowledge is shared and discussed in the context of an education. And yet, I think the thing for me that's missing in the syllabus is actually where you are transparent about who you are in this role. Because on the one hand, even if the students are actively participating in the construction of the content of the class, you're still playing a very dominant role in that that organization, helping them figure out, one, how one digs for sources, just from a technical point of view, but two, how you begin to choose what is and is not a legitimate source, or a helpful source, or a meaningful source, or an informed source, or an authoritative source on a particular topic. And given that they're all Googling 90% of the time, as opposed to using the techniques that we use, helping, there's still a lot of expertise that you bring to the table there. So one of the things that our techniques certainly made me do a lot more conscientiously and consciously was to constantly expose who I am, what's my background, where was I trained, who taught me, what are the things that I read, and how do those inform the biases that I bring to the class, and how am I working through those biases and trying to unpack them and undo them even as I'm teaching the class with the students, which encourages, I hope, skepticism on their part, to not necessarily see me and all be all of all information that they're going to get, but instead to see me as a resource, to see all their instructors hopefully as resources, but engage us in a dialogue. And I think that that's the aspiration and the anticipation of what your course is set up as, is to transform knowledge from a kind of monodirectional experience into something that's more of a dialogue, that's participatory and that's interactive. And I'd love to see something in your syllabus where you actually kind of identify who you are in this process and how you imagine your role very clearly playing out in the dynamic of the class.
Yeah, excellent suggestions, Britt. Thank you. I mean, I actually did do a lot of that. I mean, I talked about my own struggles with theory and how I've spent my whole career rebelling against the theory that I was taught by people like Colin Rowe and Lewis Mumford. And but I didn't put it in the syllabus. And I think that it's a great point, that I think there needs to be a statement, as well as my verbally talking about my struggles in this area. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Probably have time for maybe one or two more comments, and then we should shift to a last one. So Yutaka, you're next.
Thank you so much, Tom. This is really fun. Another assumption that I'm getting is that perhaps I agree with you that students bring a lot to the table, and we should bring them out instead of prescribing what they should learn. At the same time, I think some of them and some of us continue to look for limitations that would allow us to push against, and that would allow us to grow from there instead of simply being open all the time and anything goes. And I wonder how we would teach that. How do we set up and how do we recognize that here's our limit and this is a method to push back? And one of the methods that I have seen is by Damit, who was the teaching assistant to Dana Haraway. And he wrote a piece that recorded how she taught how to set or recognize a limit of our knowledge and how we start from there. And that's one thing that I would like to read in your syllabus, what kind of methodologies and tricks and tools that you would employ so that students taking your class afterwards, they can repeat it and they can apply it to other fields. And another thing that I'm getting from your syllabus is this centrality of buildings and built environment. And of course, this is an architectural theory class, so that it's in there. But one thing that our colleague Jean-Francois Bedard said, he teaches history, French court history from 17th century or something, is that, sometimes history doesn't have to be relevant to us, and it's not applicable to our time. It doesn't make it less valuable. Just because we can make it into a tool doesn't make it good. So that was really eye-opening and liberating too. So on one hand, you seem to be saying that theory is on its own and you don't have to follow any kind of prescribed path. At the same time, there's this aim to make buildings meaningful and central and make it useful make theory useful for building. So that service to buildings seems a little odd right now.
Yeah, interesting comment. Thank
So
you.
Just so we have time to look at one more, let's jump.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This was helpful. Oh, let me stop sharing.
Does it make sense to do one more, or should we just switch to a general discussion because we only have 20 minutes left? Unless, because we've been all in the same group, it's sort of one big discussion.
Right. Well, would people like a few minute break? Or are you okay to keep going? We had scheduled a very short break, but.
I'm okay to keep going. But...
Yeah, we just have 20 minutes. So
okay. Okay.
Yeah, we can look at another one. Amir, would you like to share?
Yes, sorry. Yes, so they're both very long. Again, I wasn't sure that Andrew and I would get to participate. But the story for both of these is that I was told you're teaching this seminar like a week before the semester started in both cases. So it like came together really fast. For the first syllabus, it was for first year students from different disciplines in an art school, California College of the Arts, not necessarily architects. I actually had only one possible architecture major in the class. And I based it on a syllabus at Pratt that I had been on a review for that I sort of really liked. And then I adapted it to what I thought the students would appreciate. And so the reason to look at that is because it's extremely prescriptive, because I've never done something like this before. And I also never taught first year into multidisciplinary sort of art school course. And so a lot of the people that had done this before told me just spell it all out. So this is the type of thing which is like step 1, cut the plane, step 2. And so that's one conversation I would like to have. The other one is a seminar for seniors in architecture that I taught last semester. Again, last week before the semester started, I had to sort of put it together. It was very open-ended, and I wrote the syllabus I rewrote it every week. And it was sort of like Tom's, every student had an ongoing project that started on like, say week 3. And so a lot of the syllabus isn't capturing that each person was doing these sort of individual presentations every other week and sort of building their own little research and bibliography and building to a final project. So I don't know, is there a preference for discussing one or the other from your point of view pedagogically? One is a little old for me. I don't know that I'll get a chance to teach one like that again, but it still sort of rankles me pedagogically, whether it's spelling it out like that, it's the right way to do it. But is there a preference for me to present one? Peggy says the first one. Any other thoughts?
Sounds fine
So
to me.
I can share the first one. Let me share my screen. Can you see it? Yes.
No.
Not yet.
Sorry.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Now we can.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, you can see it.
There's
Okay.
something there.
All right, I have a bad connection, so Andrea, if it falls, yeah, if it stops.
Let me see if I can do it.
Yeah, so I think the idea is maybe to just read this first page, because that's really what the course is about. So this is the title of the course, so it's not something I came up with. The idea is to teach a course. There are all these categories in the curriculum, and it's about shifting between 2 and 3 dimensions. But you have complete freedom in terms of what that means. So for some people, that's sort of 3 separate assignments. For other people, it's sort of just like one big assignment for the semester. I sort of had 3 assignments building onto one another. And I guess just for reference, I have a photo of sort of what this built out to be for the first 3 assignments, just so you know what the intent was. And so I guess I'm interested in your feedback on this first series of paragraphs. And then I would really like to discuss the amount, and we can pick one of the assignments, and we can just pick assignment. There are a lot of pages you should skip. There's a grading and stuff like that. So I'm just going to delete some of these, but These two are really the setup of the course, if you're taking some time to read them on the board. And then we can just pick any of the assignments. Let's just say the first one, because this is really the first one they see. Just talk about whether you think it's useful to be this specific about the steps. Again, this was something that I was sort of following a lot of the advice of people that had been teaching in this particular educational context. And then the other thing to consider is that the final assignment was meant to be a personal project as well as sort of like a curatorial exercise of sort of presenting their work in this way as a progress through all these steps from 2D to 3D. And then something very personal, which in some case ended up being like a dollhouse. In somebody else's case, it was a photography project. So I was trying to sort of make them more interested in this by allowing them to bring their discipline into these 2D to 3D. So there was somebody who was going into fashion and we sort of thought about fabrics and how they behave flat versus sort of beginning to sort of form themselves in certain ways. Again, somebody was sort of playing with 2D and 3D in photography. Others were doing illustration and then trying to sort of build environments out of flat illustrated environments. There was relief exercises. I haven't included those, but going from something super prescriptive to something very open-ended for a student who doesn't really have any experience in any of this and certainly doesn't understand architectural terminology in any way.
Peggy. I feel like I'm the dumb critic here, but can I just say, I read that I don't shift between 2 and 3D dimensions every day. I don't. So I don't, so I read that and I think, what's wrong with me? It's like, wow, I don't think I shifted into 2D today at all. I don't, so I'm kind of stuck at that first.
Yeah, I wondered, you have them write essays about the process, but do you also have them doing readings related to the kind of mental processes that they're going through? I mean, there's all this interesting work in neuroscience being done right now and how the brain flips from 2D to 3D and how the creative minds work, Wilma Kunsthall's work, for example. And I mean, I wonder, you're asking them to sort of think about their thinking as they make this constant shift back and forth, but how much do you get into what's actually going on in their mind as they do this? Or is this more just kind of personal statements in their essays?
Yeah, there wasn't any of that. The only reading, part of it is just the limitation of what the seminar, how much time they were spending on this seminar. This wasn't really meant to be a reading heavy seminar. I was discouraged from assigning it. The only reading I assigned was Flatland, just because it's sort of playful, but it also allows you to have a broader conversation, not just about shifting between 2D and 3D. But I think you're absolutely right. I think also at the time when I was teaching this, it was pretty early in my teaching, in my time teaching, and I hadn't really gotten interested in neuroscience. But how much such reading would you think is appropriate for a student at this level?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. There are some there's a lot of interest in the neuroscience world in us and how creative people and how designers work. And even just finding a couple of those papers are interesting. It might be of interest as it gives them a little bit of a of a background about how their brain, what's actually going on in their head as they're doing this. But yeah, you don't want to have them do a deep dive into Wilma Kunsthal's The Agile Mind. I mean, that's like a 500-page dense, you don't want to do that, but somehow find a way to convey key ideas quickly, maybe through some papers or even some reviews. I find sometimes even just the reviews of some of these books are enough for the students to kind of get the basic concepts.
Britt.
Thanks for sharing. I think that both first year beginning design assignments as well as assignments for non-studio, non-architecture majors are both super challenging, but also super liberating. Some of the constraints that are endemic to assignments that are deeper into a curriculum are kind of not on the table. So these always excite me. One of the things that I try to do when somebody asks me to look at something, look at an assignment or look at a syllabus, is figure out what's the first thing that I would cut. Because I think a lot of what we've talked about today is what we add, but sometimes it's also maybe what we subtract as a means of refining what our goals and our ambitions and aims are with any given set of assignments. And for me, the thing that I would cut is the very last page, where there's all the examples. If we're looking at the assignment of the points and lines down at the bottom.
Oh, that wasn't in the syllabus. I just put it in for your benefit. Yes, sorry. That was actually the work produced out of the course. It wasn't included.
But I think let's pretend that you did put it in, because I think that we see this quite a lot actually when assignments are presented to students as giving them examples that their work should aspire to. And I think that given our collective ambition to reconsider the sort of every peg fits into a single shape whole approach to teaching design, to me, it's one of the things that I'm always the most leery of, is providing those images and providing those examples, whether it's to colleagues or to students, particularly in the context of a creative discipline.
I'm glad you're saying that, because there was actually a lot of pushback when my colleagues saw the syllabus. I think the only thing where it had some kind of was this, which is a very silly little example. I refused to put like any sort of photos of anything that I was expecting to see on purpose, but I was told that this is an incorrect way of approaching a first year class of this sort, because students are extremely confused about what you're asking them to do. But I guess, do you think that's us being architects and wanting that surprise, or do you think it's responsible? Because I think like a lot of the conversation is having these very clear like outcomes and evaluation criteria, and I had none. And I do that on purpose because I want something exciting. Like I want somebody's mind thinking an entirely different way, just giving me something I never thought of. Like there's a way in which an architect would approach this type of exercise, and it's a way in which a fashion designer might that I haven't thought about. But is that irresponsible to the student? Me being so incredibly sort of secretive about what I'm expecting.
I think this is one of the fundamental conversations that all of us had all year long in the transparency workshops, is precisely creating the circumstances for encouraging and engendering creativity. And on the other hand, being leery of those kinds of assignments that ultimately establish in the beginning what creativity is, according to criteria which all of us were taught, which just kind of repeat the same model of learning and the same model of architectural production that all of us have been subjected to and passed through over the last 20 or 30 years. And certainly, I think, at least within the group at Syracuse, all of us were particularly, I think, excited and interested in trying to come up with ways to responsibly deconstruct those precedents and those models of learning that force everyone into the same mold.
Lori, and then if you want to lead us into the finale as well.
Sure. I mean, one thing, go ahead, Britt, you were going to say one thing? Yeah.
Which is why I tend to show art as opposed to architectural models or the output of studios. I tend to look to other fields and other creative practices as a way of subverting that. The assignment, the results of the assignment dictate how the assignment is constructed. Sorry, go ahead, Lori.
No, just more to kind of build upon what Britt had said. I think, I know speaking just for myself, I also am very incredibly reluctant, if not at all, to show examples. But one thing, working with Marianne for that workshop, which I had not thought about, is, okay, when you have students from underrepresented backgrounds who are maybe not as prepared, they have no idea what we're talking about. And so if we want to set up an assignment for success to target those students, they need to see examples. I mean, her research has shown, and she teaches art history, so she's located within, you know, art more broadly, that by showing certain kinds of examples that they may not be exactly what we're after, but that give the students some indication of what we're looking for, it will allow them to succeed in a much more significant way than if we don't show anything. Because I've never shown, like, I'm totally with you, like, I don't want to show, I don't want to prescribe. So I had not thought about the way that she's approaching it, and who that is targeting, and who that is helping become more successful in college. So I think, you know, so that's something we did talk about a lot, and that I still struggle with. And how do we, if we want to create a more transparent design studio and design education, what does that mean to provide examples for students who have never been exposed to almost anything that's design related? So I don't have an answer to your question, but it makes me think about maybe options are one of the more empowering ways to think about how we provide criteria of evaluation for students, especially from these underserved communities. So I think it's something we all as educators need to think more about as we want to further diversify our students in the discipline moving forward. So with that, thank you so much for sharing and being willing to hear critique, receive critique. We have just 7 minutes. And I know the organizers were asking us to think about ways that we have action items moving forward. I know one thing we as a group have been thinking about and trying to work on is to parlay our year experience into some sort of public dissemination, this being the first step in that. But I think I would want to advocate that we have more conversations, and that we start, you know, do we meet, or do we become a part of a subset of the lobby in this area? But I think to put that out there, like, we need to build more space and more people as a part of these conversations collectively to move education, architectural education, in a different direction. So I'll just throw that out there as a place to begin in our very limited time. Andrea.
The question I would throw back to you then is what you would ask of the lobby. So if we're really thinking about these things as kind of springboards for much larger conversations or much bigger changes, what is it that the lobby is taking on out of this work or out of this trajectory that might help to further changes in architecture education?
Well, I think, I mean, I'll just very quickly, I think, you know, you have a large platform. There's lots of people around the world that you are engaging. So this would provide a broader kind of springboard for larger conversations, whether it's a series of, you know, meetings, workshops, moving forward.
I'll just give you an example. Like, do you think tilt needs to be taught across all architecture schools? Like, all faculty need to go through a workshop like this? Like, it could be that concrete.
Yes, I would argue yes. I don't know what my colleagues feel, but I think yes.
Tamara, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I had a broader question. I joined UIC right before the pandemic, so I didn't have a lot of time and I moved to Chicago also from a different city, so I didn't have a lot of time to sort of acclimate, and I only had to meet colleagues through courses, so I never really got an introduction to the way the curriculum was set up. And my first course was a first year spring semester, like this, the first year spring semester course is an urbanism course. And this is first year undergrads, and they're designing cities. They're mashing up Hong Kong and Barcelona, and they're building these like half-mile by half-mile blocks. And it's a massive task. They don't really have the capacity, you would think, to process something like this. And yet the results are kind of stunning for the most part. Maybe not deliberate all the time, but it took me a long time and a lot of conversations with other colleagues to sort of get a sense of why this course is taught at that point in the sequence. And if I need this, I wonder to what extent do the students need this? So can we do this at the level of the curriculum and not just a syllabus, which I know is a tall task, and I know it sort of messes with the way faculty assignments are done and when syllabi are ready and all of that. But I feel like I would benefit as a faculty from knowing why we're teaching this type of course at this point in the semester. Like there's at UIC, we have the sequence, and there's this interior urbanism course that comes in the third year. If you don't know this, or if, like, I always make a point of telling my students where we are in the curriculum and how I understand the semester and why we're only focusing on X. And, you know, we're forcing you to do this thing and not something else, because their instinct is to just want to do design. Or the instinct is to want to design a building. And when you're forcing them to just do interiors or barely do form one semester, I feel like you ought to explain to them why form is precluded from the conversation. I know it's a tough ask, but I've always wondered if this transparency should extend to the way curriculum is also designed and discussed.
Emily.
Yeah, I feel a little I don't know enough about NAAB to know what exactly happens there, or how things become required by them. But I sometimes feel like accreditation ends up being the thing that can be used as a reason why not to do something, or a reason to do something. So I wonder if there's an opportunity there to, I don't know how to infiltrate it, or I don't know how to, I guess I need more education on that, but that's my thought.
Britt.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, because we're getting a lot out of this because we've never really presented this content or tried to do anything with it. So we appreciate everybody's willingness to play along, and I think it's helping us understand some of the strengths, but also like how we would have to do this differently in a different context. Two things come to mind though. One is the method, the techniques of transparency and what one hopes to accomplish with them, whether that's among colleagues, whether that's in a document, or whether that's in the dialogue with the students. The other thing that I think you probably have picked up on, as a couple of us have talked about the experience over the last 7 or 8 months, was the construction of a small community within our program. And that the 6 or 7 or 8 of us who did this, it wasn't something you could do with the entire faculty. It's not, and you're just, you know, there's different perspectives, different attitudes, different, you know, people have different degrees of willingness to participate in things like this. It was very meaningful for a core group to do. I question a little bit about how meaningful it would be for all of us to do, but I do think that we did have some, and this is going back to the question of curriculum, I think that we do have some anticipation and some aspiration for this to be something that we share with the people who coordinate in our studios, so that some of these ideas begin to infiltrate and trickle into the way in which all the documents and all of the syllabi and all of the assignments are generated within our program. But one of the takeaways I would hope from the session today is that the way to start to do this isn't just a method, but it's to get a core group of faculty that you are comfortable with, that you can trust, you can be vulnerable around, because it's hard to be vulnerable in front of everybody, especially when you're being evaluated on what you're teaching and the output of your content and output of your courses. But to me, that's one of the essential things to take away from this, is to begin to create within your own institution that initial group of individuals who are willing to participate and share.
Peggy.
You know, just thinking about what the value of this would be if it was taught everywhere. It would just shake everything up. You know, it would make us think about the things that Tom's talking about. It's like, why theory at all? Whose theory, you know, why? And the issue of curriculum that Palmyra is bringing up is like, if she doesn't know why she's teaching it, it's a problem, you know, which means that there should be a curriculum committee in the school. And maybe once the curriculum committee looks at all these new kinds of things that take into account what we're learning here, it's like, wow, things are more disrupted than we thought. I mean, and maybe one things that get disrupted, we're just refusing to listen to what NAB is prescribing to us. I mean, I guess I'm saying that what you're putting forward is more disruptive than we think, because it really just does say, we don't know how to teach. And we, you know, your first comment is like, because we don't know how to teach, we just keep perpetuating how we were taught. That's a huge disruption once we admit that. Anyway, I think it's more meaningful than one maybe realizes, and that it leads to the fights that need to happen. I don't know what else.
Joseph.
Yes, I was just gonna maybe echo some things others have already said. But first, I think I would also say thank you for participating and having the bravery to share really on the spot, because again, that's what makes these things work. One thing I was thinking about, particularly your question, Muriel, about maybe curricular change, right? Is I think that there is, and this is where I'd push back even against one of our opening statements, right? That small changes can have large impact, which on many levels I absolutely agree with. On other levels, I say there's a danger in how productive these workshops can be, to just say, well, I'm just gonna view it pedagogically. You know, I'm going to change some wording in my syllabus and just kind of fine tune this, and then I'm good, because that's going to make kind of radical change. I do think that there is a responsibility, and you touch on that very interesting point, that often you come into a school and they're like, you're teaching this 3-credit class, and it's usually not clear why you're teaching it, or where you actually fit in the curriculum, or what NAAB things you need to check, if that's even on the table for your class. So I find that you need, I don't know, maybe Britt's is a middle ground, where maybe not everyone takes the kind of tilt workshop, but you develop a kind of small group, and you can start to get a foothold on changing these things in a much more systemic way, rather than, again, viewing it kind of pedagogically and just kind of having your nice experiment, your fun assignment in your class that you've shined up. I think it needs to kind of connect. The students need to make connections between their courses, and if we don't provide that mechanism, or if we don't understand why we're teaching classes we are, I don't know how we would ever imagine our students would understand it.
Great. So we're past time. Couple of questions. Do you all want to spend a little bit of time amongst yourselves, maybe writing a sentence or two that might encapsulate the objective that you want to come out of this? Do you want me to write something? How do you want to work that?
How about we collaborate on that?
Okay. Yeah, I can set up a Google Doc and we can get something going.
Okay.
And I can invite everyone that showed up today as well. So we can do it that way. And then second question, do you all have a way of sharing the slides for a larger community? Do you want to do that? Like the tilt kind of procedures?
We can share our slides with you, and you can post them, because I know you were listing them on the Luma site. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Any other last questions or comments before we part? Rebecca.
Hi, great session. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say that I think there are several overlaps with the part that we are creating on Friday in our workshop, because one part is about the education system in architecture and how we could also rethink the curricular. So if you are interested in the discussion, we might, continue talking about it on Friday.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for putting this work together. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you all for participating and having a great conversation. Yes, this particular session is going to be recorded and it will be posted on the Luma page as well. That's everything.
Thank you,
everyone.
all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye.
day.
You too.